Disclaimer: this is going to be as factual to history as we can find, and it does mention a lot of abuse from the Queen, poisoning, as well as unaliving of people, and abuse of enslaved people. I know this week is usually my fun week. I was going to record a basically test between me and my friends. Well, more of my friends because they always want to argue over who knows me the best. And usually, yeah, I just like slide. So I was gonna give them 6 questions, but I have been sick, so I keep losing my voice. So continuous conversations with 6 different people was not gonna work in my favor because I have been feeling pretty ugh. But I can go ahead and record and pause as needed in the scenario. So that's how we got the start of this series this week. So hope you enjoy. The most ruthless and cruel queen, also known as the Serpent Queen, she was married to King Henry II and was indeed one of the most diabolical queens of France. She was implicated in murders including the massacre poisoning, child abuse, favoritism with her children, and also, last but not least, basically turning a blind eye to the incestuousness of her children. Catherine de' Medici, again, I may be butchering that name, but she was born on April 19th, 1519, in Florence, Italy. She was born to the infamous Medici family that ruled Florence with brutal political power on and off between 1200 and 1743, which is a significant time. Her father was Lorenzo de' Medici, the grandson of the likewise ruthless Lorenzo Magnificent. Her mother was Madeleine de Latour. I can't pronounce his name, but this is her. My French teacher would be appalled because I can still read and write French, but my pronunciation is terrible. It's been a long time since I was 15. But anyway, she came from a noble French family. Now, I'm not saying this to humanize people's monstrosities because I feel like people should not be doing that, period, and it's become a trend lately. But anyway, I digress. She reportedly was passed around several relatives and ended up living in a convict after an uprising against the Medici family. This is where she stayed until her teen years, and she was married to the future King of France. This marriage was arranged by her uncle, Pope Clement, who was also a member of the Medici family, looking to establish their family power in France. The marriage took place in October 1533 when she was only 14 and the groom was 15. Now, I'm not saying thankfully as in it's okay to be married at 15. I'm saying it as in a lot of these 15-year-olds are being married off to people in 30 or above. But anyway, the groom was 15 and future King Henry II. She was described as being a not so very attractive woman, but quite frankly, I don't think this really mattered to her young husband because he was already smitten with Diane. Now, Diane was 19 years his senior, and her husband's total lack of interest in her extended to the bedroom, to a degree that even his mistress Diane tried to encourage him to make more of an effort to produce an heir. That's how you know things are really bad when your mistress is trying to tell you to have relations with your wife. After 10 years had gone by without any pregnancies, doctors were consulted who diagnosed Henry as having a penile dysformality, which I don't know if that's just a court's way of saying, oh, it's an issue, we'll fix this, because he had a mistress, and I'm sure that this was not coming to be an issue with the mistress, right? But the court doctor, Jean Fennell, intervened with advice on sexual positioning and herbal concoctions, and Catherine gave birth to the first of her 10 children in January 1544. They state in paperwork through her infidelity, but technically it was his infidelity. Infidelity, not infidelity. Well, either way, he was being infidel anyway. Anyway, so even though this issue was cured, she really did not have any influence on her husband nor in the French court until after her husband's death. Now, Henry died from a huge brain infection in July of 1559, 10 days following a accident wound from a sports jousting. It was an accident, but as he lay there dying, he consistently begged to see the only woman he loved, which was Diana. But Catherine denied his final request, and after his death, she actually banished the mistress from the courts. And this is when I wouldn't even say slowly, but you could see her malevolent personality becoming more evidential into view. Although one can certainly feel sympathy for being unloved by your husband, for after all, it was an arranged marriage, which was not uncommon at all for royal marriages back then. Who knows, perhaps if her husband saw a softer side of her, maybe even slightly more loving, maybe he wouldn't have even had a mistress. But I'm not saying it's right, because this day and age, you can leave your marriage, but back then you couldn't. Her maternal skills were just as lacking as her wifely ones. In rearing and loving her children, she lacked both of those. The I guess a mother's love, like what comes naturally to us, she just didn't have that. Those children that did survive into adulthood were all harmed by her manipulation, favoritism, neglect, and just downright child abuse. After years of infertility, she ended up having 10 children, which 7 survived. Those who survived went on to become the 3 kings of France, and her daughter Elizabeth, the Queen of Spain, and daughter Margarita was the Queen of France. Her eldest son ascended the throne at the age of 15, becoming the King Francis II, but she didn't attend his coronation. She put it down to she was a grieving widow, but I highly doubt that. He only survived 14 months on the throne, and then her next eldest, Charles, became king at the age of 10, which at the time made Catherine become a queen regent, right? Like, that means she calls all the shots. How convenient. But again, Charles wasn't her favourite son, and although his reign was easily manipulated by Catherine, even as an adult, he rarely had his own thoughts and generally went along with everything that she says in hopes to win her love and affection, as children do. I mean, when one feels less appreciated, they tend to become more prone to be easily manipulated, and whether he agreed with the way she wanted to run things or not, it didn't really matter, because all he cared about was to receive love from the one person in the world that should love him, his mother. But during his reign, Catherine was very involved, supposedly trying to bring some resolution to the war between the Catholics and Protestants. One of her efforts to do so was to propose her daughter Margarita to the hand of the future King of France, Henry. He was a Protestant, and Margarita, she was in love with somebody else, and this infuriated Catherine. So much that one night she had Margarita dragged from her bedroom and proceeded, along with her son Charles, to beat her. So much that when she was pulling her hair, she was pulling out huge clumps of her hair. In the end, her mother had her way, and the marriage was set for August 18th, 1572, to take place in the Notre Dame Cathedral. Charles did not rule for too many years. Reportedly, he died of an illness that was a lot like, it caused pneumonia. It was pleurisy. I think I pronounced that right, but basically it's when the membranes rub together causing pneumonia. And he died at the age of 24, but rumours did circulate that Catherine had a hand in his demise because she wanted her favourite son Henry to ascend to the throne. Now, her daughter did continue to see the man that she was actually in love with, which was an embarrassment to the court, especially to her mother and her brother, King Henry III. Her wrath flew into such a fury that on a summer night in 1583, while the entire family are all sitting down to this scrumptious, amazing banquet, Catherine had her daughter kidnapped and transported her underground to a prison in the southwest part of France. She was imprisoned for 17 years, and during this time, to add salt to the wounds, her mother legally disowned her and withdrew her from any inheritance. But to take it a step further, which I don't understand why she needed to do this, but it says for political reasons, her Catherine and King Henry III plotted the killing of Margaret's former beloved. They tricked him into meeting Henry, and instead of him meeting Henry, he was actually brutally murdered along with 8 family members, which was completely senseless. Now, Margaret eventually would go on to write her memoirs on how much she suffered at the hand of her mother from all of the lack of love and abuse. She even spoke about how she was sexually molested by some of her brothers. Catherine had over 300 female spies in the court. She called them her flying squadron, who constantly reported like inside gossip and things heard in private. She was known to be having very lavish parties and used these pretty spies to infiltrate and gather information from all of her guests. Now, to anyone who fell in the disfavor of Catherine, as many of her enemies, they either disappeared, found ill on their deathbed, or they were already dead. Now, at the Chateau de Blios, again, sorry for my pronunciations if my French teacher ever sees this, but one can still visit a room, and it has over 327 little wooden drawers, said to have been filled with various poisons, that was suspected to have been basically her master poison concoctions that she would do to do away with people that threatened her or just simply disliked her. Among the rumoured to have been poisoned by her was Jeanne L'Albert, the mother of King Henry IV, who had previously criticised her. Catherine also had the man who accidentally caused the death of her husband murdered too. Throughout her life, Catherine was very interested in astrology and often consulted with her court astrologer. And during one of the readings, he told her that she would someday die near Saint Germain. Now, again, I'm probably saying that right, but we're going to say Saint Germain. She also had consulted the famous Nostradamus, who predicted her husband would die in the jousting act and that she would also outlive 3 of her children. Believing fully that there was a possibility she would die near Saint Germain, which she interpreted to be the church Saint Germain, which she lived across from on the street, she basically changed where she resided to try and, I guess, in her eyes, manipulate the course of death. But she left her royal palace for so-called safer grounds. She eventually retired in the Chateau de Blois, seen in this photo here. In order to get away from the Church of Saint Germain, it was there about several years later that she became very ill from a pneumonia-like illness, which I found very ironic considering that's how apparently she killed her son, right? Karma. But anyway, she died from this illness, and while she was dying, she asked to speak to a priest and welcome the sight of the young priest who administered her last rites. When she asked him his name after he read her the last rites, he replied, Julien de Saint Germain. So evidently she still died next to Saint Germain. She was born Mary Delphine McCarthy on March 19th, 1787. to a wealthy family in New Orleans. Her father was Louis McCarthy. He was knighted of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. By 1919, by 1794, her family had a 1,344 acres plantation. One would safely assume that she lived a very charmed life. Now her mother was known to be quite the hostess. She loved having parties that went on to the early hours of the morning. Some nights included jumping into the canal on their property. Now, she was known to be stealing the clothes and shoes of the male guests, forcing them to go home barefoot and nightshirts missing. She loved a good party and a good prank. While Delphine's mother passed away in 1807, her father explored companionship in an untraditional but very popular way during this time with a free woman. Her name was Sophie, and in 1815, Sophie gave birth to a daughter, Delphine McCarthy. Because nobody can come up with original names, everybody has Delphine in their names in this story, just to let you know. But the child's godparents were actually Delphine and her brother, Louis. And records did go to show that a lot of the McCarthy men had relationships with free women of colour or women of mixed race. Delphine's uncle Eugene had a 54-year relationship with a woman of colour. I can't pronounce her name. Her name is, I'm just going to call her Al. It's a okay, I'm just going to butcher it. But anyway, she was the daughter of an enslaved woman and the Count himself. Eugene and Al did go on to have 7 children together in what appeared to be a very successful union. She may not have cared, but we also know it was a different time back then. But he also had children with 2 other free women of color. In fact, it was like 5 children in total. New Orleans history tells us of quite a few wealthy Creole men practicing the cohabitation, is what it's documented down as, cohabitation with women of color. And Delphine's father, uncle, cousins, and associates all contributed to the development of the biracial free people of color. They were trying to help free women of color, people in color in general. So I do want you to keep that in mind as we talk about Madame Lalaurie, because it kind of goes against everything. It's like, was she bitter towards her dad for remarrying a woman of color? Well, being with a woman of color after her mother died? I don't know, but it seems that way. But anyway, these women were referred to in the legal system as concubines. The Creoles called them places. Research provides there were quite a few women of mixed race who were in relations and had children with the McCarthy man. Let's let that seed resonate a little bit while we explore the life of Delphine Madame Lalaurie, because there's a reason why I pointed all of this out. Now, she was barely 14 when she married her first husband, a 35-year-old widow, Raymond. Now, he was of the Spanish court and second in command to the Louisiana governor. He had recently lost his wife on the voyage from Spain to Louisiana and stepped into his appointed position. He and Delphine were married by the bishop in private ceremony on June 11th, 1800. 5 years later, Raymond made Delphine a mother and a widow. Now, it is known that throughout his marriage, he was very bitter towards the military in general, because they do feel like had they have waited a month to send him, his wife would still be alive. He was very much still in love with his wife during their marriage. And he did a lot of things to aggravate the military along the way, which I believe did play a big part in his death. Raymond boarded his ship to make his way back to his expecting wife on January 11th, 1805. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shore of Havana, and Raymond was killed around the same time Delphine gave birth to their daughter, Mary Delphine Francisa Borja Lopez. And it's a mouthful. Here's the name. But the reason why I want you to know the full name is because part of her name, she actually named her daughter after Raymond's dead wife. Delphine stayed in Havana long enough to bury her husband and have her daughter's baptism. She then returned home to New Orleans as a young widow and mother, just to discover that New Orleans was no longer under Spanish or French rules, but now under American ownership. The young widow would soon be married again. On Delphine's 20th birthday, on March 19th, 1807, and just a few weeks after her mother had died. She married an older Frenchman, a widower, Paul. Delphine's mother had divided her estate between all three of her children, and Jean Paul was a very savvy businessman, and perhaps he saw inheritance as an opportunity. I don't want to say perhaps, I want to say almost certain, because he was very interested after she inherited her money. And he seemed to be a little bit of a swindler himself. On the outside looking in, this man looked like, oh, he would be great for her. But Delphine's inheritance was 33,000, which made a healthy dowry for a marriage to her new husband. Her mother also left her a downtown plantation on the bank of the Mississippi River with 52 slaves and livestock and farm equipment. Her father gifted Delphine and Jean another plantation with property on Charter Street and an additional 26 slaves. In total, the value of her inheritance, she was worth $2 million. Now, her husband went on to purchase a two-story townhome on the Royal Ancantine, next door to the Bank of Louisiana, where he was the director. By 1815, they had 5 children, the eldest being the daughter from Delphine's first husband, and the family would split their time between the townhome and the plantation. Delphine and Jean had secured a privileged life for themselves, but things were, of course, not always as they seem. Less than a year Less than a year after the Battle of New Orleans, the 50-year-old Jean passed away. Delphine, just 28 years old, was left to settle Jean's estate, which I think is disgusting in all aspects, because this still continues to this day and age, and I don't think it should be a thing. I believe if somebody dies, that debt should die with them, because people didn't go out and get these debts in. They didn't have the executive decision to get these debts in their name, right? Now, Delphine was just 28 years old, and she was left to settle his debts, which totaled over 160,000, which in today's currency would be 2.5 million currency. In 1816, Delphine renounced her community property to the courts and forfeited their mutual assets to protect and keep her own personal assets. Over the past 10 years, Over the next 10 years, I should say, Delphine auctioned off as much of Jean's property, including enslaved people, to try and pay off some of his debts. She even purchased one piece of his property herself at an auction, as well as retaining some of his slaves. Which I don't know why she even wanted the slaves, because records did show that 8 of the enslaved people that she did now own died in the span of about 5 years. And the sad thing is, most of these were either children or women of childbearing age. And of course, their cause of death was noted as unknown, but we know what she did. The debt that Jean left behind did deplete Laurie's wealth. Daphne's luck came in a very morbid way. Her father did pass away in 1824, leaving his children with a very substantial inheritance. His daughter that he did have with the free woman of color was included in his will, but he only left her 5,000 and 2 slaves. I believe that it should have been split equally. I don't know why she got so much less than everybody else, but I guess different time, but it's absolutely disgusting. I guess we should just be glad that he left it anything at all. But that leads us to her final husband, who gave her the infamous last name. This was Dr. Louis Lalaurie. He came into the picture in 1825. Delphine was now an experienced and shrewd woman of wealth. Larry arrived from France with a mission to start his own physician practices. He called himself the destroyer of hunches. He was basically a chiropractor, straightening crooked backs, and in 1826, one of Delphine's children needed some help being straightened out. I wonder if the saying straightening out like with children, like, oh, I'll straighten them out, came from these terms. Because, like people are crooked, so they straighten them out. Anyway, I digress. I'm sorry, ADHD. But one of Delphine's children needed some help straightening out their back, and that's how their romance began, I guess, if you want to call it that. I call it him seeing a opportunity. And I say this with a light heart because I am 30 plus years shipping and handling. I will not disclose my full age. But she was considered an older woman at the ripe age of only 38, with 2 dead husbands, 5 children, but she did have a considerable amount of wealth. So a lot of people did speculate, but let's face it, we know, we know that their blossoming relationship was due to him wanting money and her having money. Because in that day and age, she was classed as a used woman, I guess. But she came with money because if it wasn't for the money, no man would look in her direction at this point in time. But Madame Laurie became pregnant with Dr. Laurie's child out of wedlock, which of course is a no-no. 5 months after giving birth to their son, Jean-Louise Leonard Laurie, Dr. Laurie and Madame Daphne, Delphine, were at a notary non-negotiating their marriage contract. Now, Delphine was now worth 66,389.58 thousand. Once their property and finances were sorted out, they headed over to St. Louis Cathedral to make it legal in the eyes of the Catholic Church. However, it has been discovered that the date of their marriage was rolled back 6 months, having a child out of wedlock, which of course, that's a no-no. Nay, nay, it's very frowned upon outside of the church and the Catholic high society to have a child out of wedlock. I don't know where she thought this fraud would come into play. The now 40-year-old Delphine was on her third husband, and the 25-year-old Dr. Lalaurie, yes, he was 25, was a new father in a new country with a very wealthy wife. Archived letters written by friends mentioned that the marriage was extremely unhappy. They were known to fight often and separate, then return to each other. Some of these letters began to make early mentions of Delphine's cruelty to her slaves. Now, she claimed that Lalaurie had threatened her in such a manner as to render their living together insupportable. She also claimed that Lalaurie had beaten her in front of witnesses. Now, these are direct quotes. 5 months later, Dr. Lalaurie basically consented to moving permanently into his newly acquainted residence in Paris. And I don't blame him. But he had reportedly told the police about all of the things that he didn't like. But in 1831, Madame Delphine Lalaurie purchased the lots on Royal and Hospital, now Governor Nichols, which would become the infamous haunted Lalaurie Mansion. But their lavish home did not make their marriage work, didn't make it happy, didn't make them happy at all. And I don't know why people think buying a new house will make everything better. It's like trying to have a child to make their marriage better, right? But on November 16th, 1832, Delphine Lalaurie petitions the courts for a separation from the bed and board of her husband. Now, on April 10th, 1834, a fire broke out inside of the house of Delphine and her estranged husband. Through the smoke and flames, the ugly truth was exposed and suspicions confirmed. The Lalaurie mansion, a beautiful home, held such disgustingly ugly secrets. Now, there has been a lot of abolished theories of this, of course. American Horror Story did their own take on this. But this is what was noted in newspapers by witnesses between police reports and statements taken at the time. Just as within any scandal, the stories were embellished throughout time. But this is, like I said, the immediate reports of eyewitnesses' accounts and horrifying atrocities. 7 slaves were rescued from the deplorable, absolutely deplorable conditions. 7 slaves were rescued, their bodies covered with scars and loaded with chains. They were taken out on stretchers and delivered to safety, while a mob proceeded to destroy the furnishings of her home in an absolute outrage. Now, those were the direct statements quoted, but it started with Judge Jacques Francis. The judge was actually a neighbor of the Lalauries and one of the first to arrive to the scene of the fire. Some of the early arrivals began to help the Lalauries transfer their valuables to safekeeping in case the fire started to spread, because right now it was kind of placed in the kitchen in the outbuilding, but they were trying to be good citizens, trying to be neighborly, and trying to help her to protect the possessions that she currently has. Now, during this time, a few of the concerned citizens began to tell the judge about the captive, bonded people. Just like, it's disgusting, but they tried to tell the judge, and the judge politely asked permission of Dr. Lalaurie to have the slaves removed and taken to safety. It is reported that Madame Lalaurie replied, and I believe this is quoted in American Horror Story too, but there are those who would be better employed if they would attend to their own affairs instead of intruding with the concerns of other people. Now, keep in mind, these are people that were helping them. They were helping them save their valuables, and she still has the audacity to be disgustingly rude because they're simply asking her to save human life. The flames began to spread, and the judge ordered everybody to break down the doors. It was then that citizens were truly met by the scene of such horrendous things that nobody could have been prepared for. Depending on the source, the level of discovery in the gruesomeness varies, but even the tamest of descriptions is nothing less than appalling. The mob mentally shifted from people helping to people beginning to smash the contents of the mansion, destroying the Laurie's property and belongings. It was no different from the way that Laurie had treated these poor people in their home. It was absolutely disgusting. And it was horrendous during a time where slavery was around, that people could look at these poor people and be like, this is appalling. Her victims, people described as horribly mutilated, with some being suspended by the neck and their extremities stretched out and torn. The judge told another judge that when he arrived, he was appalled by everything that he saw in one of the apartments. Some slaves were even chained and were left exposed to perish in their confines. The judge, accompanied by a few other citizens, discovered two other people incarcerated, and they were let out. One was wearing an iron collar, a very large and heavy. It was extremely large and heavy iron collar, and was chained with a very heavy iron chains on their feet. I'm sorry, I had to record this a few times because it was disgusting to even think. Because I'm the kind of person, like, when I'm reading something or somebody's telling me a scenario, it basically plays in my mind. So this was extremely disgusting. That's why I don't do any of these stories on children or animals, because that's just my no go to. But let me reiterate. So, one was wearing an extremely large and heavy iron collar, along with chains with made out of heavy iron on their feet, by their feet. And they walked with great difficulty, of course. Who wouldn't? Now, unfortunately, days after the fire, one of the slaves who had been removed from the residence did not survive, and bones were also excavated from the Laurie's courthouse. It was documented that one set of the bones was one of those of a young slave girl that Madame Delphine had chased straight out of a window, allowing the young girl to fall to her death, and then was buried on the property. As unbelievable as this scene was, there was numerous records and letters written years prior by Jean, stating that Delphine had been brought before the criminal court for, quote, the barbaric treatment of her slaves, but was absolved for lack of accusers willing to testify they had seen her beating these slaves. Basically, nobody wanted to come forward as a witness to say what her late husband, Jean, had been trying to tell people. Like, he reported it numerous times that she was a horrendous woman that had no value for life at all. Madame Lalaurie did have one loyal servant on her staff, this we know for sure. As the flames took out her house, her enslaved coachman brought her carriage around, and Delphine stepped into it with complete confidence. The mob was stunned initially. It was said that the angry citizens tried desperately to hold on to the horses and snatch her from the carriage, but still the coachman used his whip and plunged the horses forward in escaping the crowd. Just as the stories surrounding her cruel and heinous actions towards her slaves have circulated, so have the speculation and rumors of where exactly she ended up. Now, it turns out an American poet by the name of William Bryant published a journal that uncovered this mystery for us. Madame Laurie's reputation had made it across the country. Bryant also wrote that Delphine spent time in a mobile before making a journey out of New York with her husband to his native country. I'm guessing mobile, they mean like mobile home. I'm not sure, it just says mobile. But I guess her estranged husband that she says she couldn't live with no more actually helped her escape, because looks like they headed to France. Now, Delphine and Louise eventually ended up in Paris, with Delphine's children coming over for extended stays from time to time. Louis did live off of Madame Laurie's wealth. Of course, we all knew that's why he even got there in the first place. But he lived off of her wealth until eventually her complaining wasn't worth the millions. Apparently, she complained a whole lot. But he left Paris and made his way to Havana. Shortly after that, Delphine's family slowly moved over to Paris, where they occupied the homes of the first artisans. She had her family back together. So basically, she never got in trouble for the horrendous acts that she did, and she actually got to die with her family surrounding her in France. Not very happy about that. But thank you for tuning in, guys. Well, thank you for joining us for 2 out of the 10 most dangerous women of the world. Go ahead and stay tuned because this will be a 5-part series with 2 in each one. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe and go ahead and comment what you think of the video. Help my channel to grow, and I love you guys so much, and I hope you have an amazing week.